Hi, I'm Brad Dacus.
And I'm Kyle Campbell.
Welcome to Faith and Law.
We're breaking down political and legal issues of the day through a biblical lens.
Hi, I'm Brad Dacus, and welcome to Faith and Law. In today's society, Christians, people of faith, find themselves having to navigate through different cultural and legal issues. In fact, what we're facing today are issues where we have faith, policy, social society values all converging together. Classic example was manifested through the recent passage of legislation by Congress. It's the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act. Now, this has only passed the House yet. It has yet to pass the Senate. But why was it enacted? What's it about? Well, what it says is, real simple, that if you're a boy, you can't compete in girls' sports, and vice versa. It's real simple, plain. Why does it even have to be passed? And even more importantly, also, why wasn't it passed unanimously, but in fact was passed pretty much along party lines? Well, here's the history. Here's the background. You see, back in 1972, Congress decided to pass Title IX. At the time, girls, if they wanted to play basketball, they had to compete with the boys on the school basketball team. There was just one basketball team. Same thing with tennis, same thing with swimming. Well, in 1972, we said, you know what? If females are to have the same equal opportunity in not just job, but also in sports, they need to have their own league. They need to have their own people to compete with because females are built differently, very differently, than boys. It's that simple. It's clear biological fact. Well, Title IX was passed. Boys had their sports leagues, girls had their sports leagues. Neither of the two shall meet until the Biden administration decided to, via executive order, command and say, oh no, we're changing that. So that if a boy claims to have gender identity dysphoria, where he sees himself as a female, then that boy has a right to compete in the girls' sports. No matter how big he is, no matter how muscular, he has a right to compete in the girls' sports. And so that is what has happened all across the nation. You have case examples where a boy competes in wrestling in the girls' sports. They're not only winning the sports in swimming and other activities, but they're also in the process hurting girls, hurting females in volleyball, etc. This has been outrageous, and it's been very, very widespread. So, the voters last November said enough is enough, and this became an actual major issue in the campaign. Protect our girls, protect our women, stop this senseless disrespect for them, not just on the field, but also, for that matter, in the locker room. So, they decided to submit this bill, the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act. My premonition is that it's going to pass the Senate, and as soon as it passes the Senate, President Donald Trump is going to immediately sign it into law. Folks, our women, our girls, they deserve nothing less. Let's make sure we never make this mistake again. Now, I'd like to bring onto the show someone who has been able to address this and other issues where we have this conflict of inclusivity, but at the same time, sensibility and moral, faith-based, rational thinking. To help me do that, I'd like to bring onto the show now Joe Dallas. Joe, welcome to the show. You've written a number of books. In fact, specifically, there's a book you wrote about 20 years ago about some of these issues. And I want you to comment about how things have sort of evolved and changed since then, since you wrote that book with regards to where we are today.
Back in 1996, it was about 28 years ago, actually, so when I wrote the book, I said that the church's embrace of homosexuality would increase over the next couple of decades, and that would not only strengthen the gay rights movement, but that it would also embolden two other movements, the polygamy movement and the pedophile movement. And what I proposed then was that these arguments that we're hearing from gay rights organizations will be co-opted by other movements, and indeed they have, with some degree of success. So that has been a development I'm very sad about. But let me tell you another one I'm especially sad about, and that is the minimizing of the seriousness of the issue. In my book, I pointed out that I was on staff with the Pro-Gay Church from 1978 to 1984. And in those days, we hoped that the church at large, the evangelical Bible-believing church, would either revise its position on homosexuality and say, hey, the Bible doesn't really condemn it, there's a new way to interpret it, gay is okay in God's sight, or minimize the seriousness of it and say, well, it's kind of like the doctrine of the pre-tribulation rapture. You say one thing, I say another, but we don't break fellowship over that. That's a secondary issue. And so what we're seeing now is indeed, in many cases, and sometimes from very prominent evangelicals, you're hearing a minimizing of the seriousness of homosexuality, as though it may be wrong, but it's not that seriously wrong that we have to invoke church discipline over it or take a very clear stand. The weakening of our positions leads to serious doctrinal error, which leads to serious moral error, which leads to family breakdown. That's the problem.
Now, Joe, I know in the past the church has been somewhat silent with regard to LGBTQ issues. They didn't want to talk about what they are. Why is it that the church in the past has been so hesitant, so silent to address LGBTQ issues?
Well, the subject has always been controversial, and I think we have made it more so because we have adopted the world's attitude towards it. I'm 70 years old. When I was growing up in the 1960s, the world, I should say the culture, the secular culture, had widespread contempt for homosexual people. They were called queers, fags, pansies, freaks. Unfortunately, that worldly attitude influenced the church, not in its position. The church's position was right, that homosexuality is a sin falling short of God's will. But when the subject was addressed in the church, too often it was addressed with worldly contempt. Not just a statement that this is wrong behavior, that this is something God didn't intend, but also contempt for the people themselves. So we were allowing the world's attitude to influence the Christian position. Now, the world has largely shifted to a pro-gay position, and again, we are allowing the world to influence the church. So you're seeing more and more pastors either revise their position and say, well, maybe if people have felt gay all their lives, God meant them to be that way, and if God means them to be that way, who are we to say that it's a sin? Which is a very sloppy way of approaching doctrine, but a lot of people are approaching it that way. Other pastors just don't want to say anything about it, because they are very aware of the way the world feels, and that if you say that homosexuality is a sin, you will be called a homophobe, a hater, a bigot. And pastors today, some pastors, too many pastors, I believe, are wanting to be on good terms with the world. So it gets back to a problem of worldliness, and I think that's where the controversy is, because if we simply addressed it the way the Bible addresses it, it is one of many sexual behaviors that is common to the human condition, condemned by God, and that people can be redeemed out of. That's a very simple position. That's the biblical one.
Now, I know many Christians out there, if they meet someone who fits into the category of LGBTQ, they're often sort of feeling awkward. They often don't know what they should say, how they should respond. What advice can you give Christians on how best to respond, connect with individuals who fit in that category?
Of course, the best response is the one that meets the need of the individual. And that will vary from person to person. So whenever we say the gay community, we're talking about a very broad group of people. In fact, there's something even broader, and that would be the population of people who feel homosexual attractions. Many of them are not even a part of the gay community. They don't identify as gay, they don't approve of it. So our response should be according to need. If we know someone who is openly gay, openly lesbian, and saying, hey, this is who I am, and they don't know Christ, we want to interact with them the way Jesus interacted with the Samaritan woman. She was in sexual sin. He didn't condone that, but he didn't make that the main issue because she didn't know him. She needed to be born again. And that's what anybody needs. I mean, if someone is gay, but they're not born again, the state of their soul is much more important than their sexual persuasion. So we want to take an evangelistic approach to them. To those who claim to be Christian, we want to take a more apologetic or pastoral approach and say, hey, what saith the scripture? You're living in error. To people within the church who struggle with homosexual temptations and are not embracing them, we want to say, hey, we're with you, brother. We encourage you to live the disciples' life. Do not give in to those temptations. We have our temptations we have to resist. You have yours. Let's let God sanctify us together. So the proper response, again, would be towards the need of the individual.
Now, I know surveys show that there's been an explosion of children across America, principally in public schools, who identify as being part of the LGBTQ identity. A lot of parents are really concerned out there what's going to happen to their kids. So, what advice do you have for parents on how to raise their children in a world that we have today? And what are some of the specific alternatives or options that parents should consider based upon these modern day challenges?
We have to start talking to our kids earlier in life about these things than we normally do. I'll be the first to say I resent this. I resent all of this. I think kids should be left alone and have their innocence and should not have to even hear about these things. Unfortunately, if you were raising your kids in an area where there were wars in the street every day, you'd have to talk to them about war and self-protection and how to stay alive. You'd have to, even though a child shouldn't have to face that. The same is true today. We have to start talking to our kids early in life about the fact that we have a creator. We know and worship our creator. We come to our Creator through Jesus Christ, as all people must come. The Bible in our home is our guiding principle. And you know what, kids? That's going to make us different. So get used to the idea that we are different. Our values are different. Our standards are different. But in this house, we believe our Creator had an intention for the way we relate. You will have friends who call themselves gay, lesbian, or trans. You are to love them as God loves them. You are also, as opportunity allows, to share the truth with them, both the gospel truth and the truth about God's intention for our sexuality. And you will have to accept the fact that some will accept that and some won't.
So, Joe, I've got a tough question for you, but I know you can answer it. Sometimes Christians know of people who are in same-sex sexual relationships and they're getting married and they're invited to the wedding. What would you advise? What do you think Jesus would do in today's society if he were invited to attend a homosexual marriage or a transgender homosexual marriage? What's your take on this? And what's a true Christian biblical response to this kind of an issue that is really facing a lot of Christians today?
No, I do not. Jesus would go to any gay person. Jesus would interact with any gay or lesbian person or trans person or football player or homecoming queen or mass murderer. There is no one Jesus wouldn't go to as an individual. And welcome if they wanted to hear the truth and believe on him. And even if not, he interacted with people of all kinds, sitting and dining with them, and that doesn't mean that all of them got converted. What he would not do is participate in anything that was against the very clearly revealed will of God. And a same-sex wedding ceremony would be that. So he would not violate what the word says about separation. We're not called to be separate necessarily from people, but from any activity outside God's will. So Paul told the Ephesians, do not have any fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, rather reprove them. He told Timothy, don't be a participant in someone else's sins. Now, if you attend a wedding, you're not just attending a social event. You're attending a ceremony, and by your attendance there, you are making a statement of affirmation. And that goes for any wedding ceremony. You know, if I had a friend who was heterosexual who had been married 20 years and he just dumped his wife because he fell in love with a younger woman and married the younger woman, I wouldn't be there. Because by my presence there, I would be saying, I bless this union. If you cannot say that, then you have no business being there. Jesus would interact with gay people and love them as he loved everyone else. He would not go to a strip club. He would not go to a house of prostitution, and he would not go to a same-sex wedding, all for the same reason. He wouldn't participate in something that his presence would be seen as a statement of approval.
Thank you so much, Joe. This is such an important topic that really leads us into our next segment here on Faith and Law. And that is, let's talk policy and some of these new policies that are coming out of our legislative bodies. So as you guys have probably heard, the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act has passed the House. Now it goes to the Senate for a vote there, but this is kind of the culmination of a big discussion nationally that we have been having over the past several years on how do we define who is eligible to play and participate in women's sports. Is it women who are female assigned at birth, or is it anyone who identifies as a female and a woman who wants to participate in women's sports? This topic's become a hot one recently and has even led President Trump to very recently draft and implement the Keep Men Out of Women's Sports executive order that you might have seen him surrounded by young girls and young women, all athletes who joined him in the Oval Office to sign that executive order. As we all remember, Riley Gaines, who was a student athlete and swimmer in college, really broke onto the scene and brought this to the forefront of our minds as she was forced to not only swim and compete at a very high level against a biological male who was saying he identified as female, Leah Thomas, but was physically completely male top to toe. But in addition to having to compete against him, Riley Gaines and other athletes were forced to share a locker room with this biological male. And as she reports and tells this story, this man would undress fully and completely in front of all of these women, including herself. And it really brought forward not just a discussion about the fairness of this competition and about how do we protect women and girls in their athletic endeavors, which are so important to them, but how do we protect them in this way against being forced to undress, disrobe, shower, and be in an enclosed space where nakedness is happening with someone who says they're a woman, but clearly are physically a man. So here we have this act, and right away, right after this passed the House and right after President Donald Trump signed the Keep Men Out of Women's Sports executive order, the NCAA followed suit and amended their transgender and their participation policies. So this really harkens back to Title IX, and Title IX is part of the Education Amendment of 1972, and it dictates who is eligible to participate in certain categories of sports. Now, Biden, toward the end of his administration, tried everything he could up until his last day almost to amend Title IX to include not just that any biological female can participate in women's sports, but anyone identifying as a woman can participate. So it became not what your biological sex is, but just simply what you identify as. Now, of course, this got struck down over and over as he attempted it, and now this act and executive order are coming along. We'll see if it passes the Senate and if there are any challenges to Donald Trump's executive order. But the discussion becomes one that we have had on a number of fronts here about those who believe they are transgendered in not just our country, but really anywhere. It's a cultural question. And as men and women of faith, we need to be clear on how God and how the Bible has shown us over and over that God created a man and God created a woman from Adam's rib. There was no flowing back and forth between those two. It was very, very clear. And again, the White House has reconfirmed this in stating that as far as the federal government is concerned, it's male and female, and that's it. Two genders. Also, the pronouns are out in all federal employee signature lines in any communications. So we're getting back to biblical truth. We're getting back to basics, and those are a good thing. But as men and women of faith, we have a participation responsibility in this conversation. Now, we know where we stand as believers, but our culture likes to say, what does the science say? So let's talk about the science of this. Science tells us, and if we're trusting that science, they say over and over that biological sex is not immutable. Brad loves to talk about this. He knows a whole lot about it. But essentially, you cannot take one sex, a male, and no matter what you do, pump a body full of hormones, replace body parts, try to manipulate organs, reproductive organs, it is scientifically and biologically not possible to change one sex into the other. God made males and females so beautifully different. It's remarkable when you get into the science of it. There are 6,000 genetic differences between the sexes. The brain is completely different. The body is completely different. For men who are identifying as women and wanting to experience pregnancy and giving birth, the hip bones, everything in that area, again, completely different and not possible for any other sex or gender other than female to become pregnant and give birth. There is a supernatural design to our sex and the differences between them. They complement each other. Eve was Adam's helper, and there is a purpose to each uniquely and specially. And we have to respect that. And now we've got a presidential administration and legislative bodies, if we're talking law, who are going to come alongside, reinforce that, and respect it. So as men and women of faith, how do we get involved in our communities with respect to this issue? Number one, stay informed. There are a lot of different accounts, not just, say, Riley Gaines on social media or PJI or Following Faith and Law, but a number of people who are speaking out on this issue in truth. Make sure you're following along with these developments, what's going to happen at the Senate with the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act. So stay informed. Always, I will direct you to PJI's website for resources. They have some of the best resources. But also as a community, we need to support each other in getting involved civically. Even at the lowest, smallest level, start small. Those of you who are younger, you're fresh out of college, get involved. Go sit on your school's board. Show up at a school board meeting and thank them for protecting women and girls in sports. Set the expectation for your community that you're keeping eyes and ears out with regard to this issue. And as a community, we are expecting our school districts to do the right thing here. All right, team. Well, more to come soon. We will keep you updated on if this passes the Senate. We are hopeful that it does. But make sure you're following along at PJI and Faith and Law so that you can keep track of important legislation and policies coming out of the administration that affect you and your family, especially as people of faith.
Now, folks, as we look at these new developments and challenges that we're facing today, we've always got to go back to the Word. I mean, that's our foundation. That's our truth. That's our hope. So let's take a look at Galatians 6:9. It says, "Let us not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will heap a harvest if we do not give up." So, are we going to grow weary at times? We're going to feel, yeah. But don't let that bring you down. Don't let that control you. Keep moving on and keep your eyes on Christ, our hope, the author and perfecter of our faith. It's easy to get discouraged and want to just give up when we don't see things working out the way we want them to work out, the way we expect them to work out. No, keep our eyes on Christ and do not grow weary and continue to do what God has called you to do, to live for Him. And if you don't give up, He promises that there will be a harvest that you will be reaping in the end of the day when you stay faithful to what He's called you to do. Now, what are some takeaways? First, be bold, right? Be bold. Stand firm in truth. When people around you are saying one thing and you know for a fact that that's not true and it goes against the word, gentleness with love and grace, share the truth. When we don't share the truth, we're not really exhibiting the love of Christ, especially when we know that these lies and these deceptions are going to destroy people, destroy lives, cause hurt, pain. So let's be bold. The love of Christ compels us to be bold. Second, let's show compassion. Sometimes we're going to meet people along the way. We're not going to necessarily understand them. We're going to see people who may be very different in how they're carrying themselves, very different in their worldview and perspective. Well, we were once lost as well. God calls us lost and found for a reason. So let's not be surprised when people who are lost act like they're lost. And let's love them right where they are with the hope that we might be able to offer them the truth and the light that comes through faith in Jesus Christ. Point 3, wisdom. Fact is, you're going to have times where you're not going to know how to respond. I mean, it's just that simple. You're going to say, oh, wow, what do I do here? How do I respond to this? The best place to look is to seek it from the Lord. Ask the Lord, how many times do we have problems and conflicts or issues just simply because we don't even think about asking the Lord and saying, God, give me wisdom. I can't do this. I can't do this on my own. Well, our God is an awesome God, and through the power of the Holy Spirit, He will give you wisdom and guidance beyond that which you know you could have come up with yourself. But we need to humble ourselves and to seek Him. Now, the world's going to tell you, hey, this is the way things are. We shouldn't follow the world. That should not be our focus. And we shouldn't be concerned whether the world thinks favorably of us. That should not be our focus. Instead, our focus needs to be on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. And with that, we can continue on. And with that, the confidence that in the end, there will be a reaping and a harvest that will last for eternity. This time on earth is very short. So let's make the most of it. Let's follow the Lord. Let's take our faith seriously and let the love of Christ compel us not to be silent with the hope and the good news that's within us. The fact is, folks, we're going to have a lot of challenges. We live in a challenging world. But remember this, no matter how great the challenges, no matter how great the struggle, always, always keep the faith.